Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. In episode 55 of Blazor Train, I showed you how to add identity-based authentication and role-based authorization to an existing .NET 7 Blazor server app. In this episode, I'll show you how to add identity to an existing hosted Blazor WebAssembly app. You know, auth in WebAssembly is tricky because there needs to be an API layer. And also the UI for registering, logging in, and logging out and all that, it's all server-based. Stick around though. Microsoft is redesigning this for .NET 8. Adding identity to a hosted Blazor WASM app is coming up right here, right now on Blazor Train! So I've created a repo for this at github.com/carlfranklin/add-identity-wasm. We are going to take an existing hosted Blazor WebAssembly project and we are going to wire up individual accounts with ASP.NET Core identity and a SQL database. And so this repo has not only the finished code, but all of the stuff that you're going to need to do along the way. First, some definitions. Authentication. This is the process of confirming that a user is the person they say they are. This user is represented by an identity. Authorization is different. Now that we know the user's identity, what are we going to allow them to do? Authorization is allowing or disallowing the user from accessing aspects of your application based on their identity and the roles or other claims that they present. A role is simply a name, like admin, supervisor, or content manager. You can assign users to one or more roles, and then check those roles at runtime to authorize the user to do or see something in the application. We're going to use roles in this video. A claim is more generic. This is an assertion by the user, such as their name or email address, and it can also be very specific to an aspect of the application, such as can click the counter button. But guess what? A role can do that too. So there are many ways to do authentication and authorization in a Blazor WebAssembly application. We're going to use the ASP.NET Core identity subsystem, including support for roles. Now, when you create a new hosted Blazor WebAssembly app in Visual Studio, the template doesn't include support for identity, but we're going to add everything needed to generate an identity database, which is a standard schema used by the ASP.NET Core identity subsystem. Well, almost everything. When we're done, our Blazor WebAssembly app will allow users to register, log in, and log out. We can then authorize sections of markup, entire pages, and even code based on whether or not the user is authenticated and what roles they are in. So I'm going to create a new Blazor WebAssembly app here. I'm going to call it Add Identity WASM. And I'm not going to select any authentication type. We're going to consider this our existing application. Now I'm going to configure the server project first. Right here, I'm going to add a new item group with all of the packages that I need. And these are all in the repo. You're going to need all of these. Now, Visual Studio has a scaffolding wizard built in for adding ASP.NET Core identity features. However, as of this writing, which is mid-July 2023, the scaffold-generated code hasn't caught up to what's in the Blazor WebAssembly template when you specify individual accounts. So rather than use the scaffolding wizard, I'm going to give you all the little pieces that you can add to an existing project. In most cases, you can copy and paste right out of the repo README file. First thing we need to do is in the app settings JSON file, we're going to add a couple of items here. First of all, the connection string. I'm going to be creating a database called Add Identity WASM. You can call it whatever you want, but I'm just calling it the same as my application. Next, I have this little bit for identity server. The only thing that you have to make sure is this client. That has to be the name of your client app, Add Identity WASM Client in this case. Now here's something that I found out the hard way. Expand app settings JSON and look at app settings.development.json. Yep, you got to add a little identity server magic here as well. Identity server, key, type, development. Otherwise, it won't work while you're debugging. So now I'm going to go back to the server CS proj file, and right here in the property group at the top, I'm going to add a user secrets ID tag and the name of the database, add identity WASM. All right, still sticking with the server side, we're going to create a models folder, and to it we're going to add a class, application user. Now this extends identity user. I don't really have anything to extend right now, but it's a good bet that you're going to be extending it somehow in the future. Now we need a DB context. So I'm going to add a data folder and add to that application DB context. Now, where did I get all this magic goo? Well, this stuff is created for you when you create a new hosted Blazor WebAssembly template with the individual accounts option as the authentication type. I just went looking for all the stuff that got generated and made a list. Copy and paste. That's a technical term. So now there's a bunch of goo that we need in program CS. And I'm going to put it right here after we create the builder. So we've got a connection string, which we're grabbing out of configuration, default connection, and then we're adding the application DB context, telling it to use SQL Server with that connection string. I'm calling add database developer page exception filter. I'm calling add default identity as an application user, and we have options here, and add roles, identity role, and that's so that we can use roles. And we're going to use the entity framework store, application DB context. This configures identity server with the application user in the DB context. We're specifying that we want to use the OpenID name user claim and the OpenID role user claim. And this guy right here, I believe this just removes the role claim from the inbound claim map. So then we're calling add authentication with add identity server JWT, JWT. Down below use routing, we're going to add these two lines, use identity server and use authorization. Now there's one more thing we need, and that's right here. If we're in development, we want to say app.useMigrations endpoint. Now I'm going to build the solution before moving on. Next, I'm going to open the package manager console, and I'm going to enter this command, add-migration, create identity schema. Now you had to have had all of this stuff in here, the DB context and the application user, before this would work. So let's do it. Now, what's it going to do? Well, it's going to create a migration, and that we can use to actually build the database. Done. So if you look over here, there's a migrations folder now, and we have the create identity schema in there, and we also have a model snapshot. But this is the real powerful thing here, create identity schema. So this will actually, when run, will create the database with all the tables and everything that we need to do authentication. Next, package manager console, update-database. This will create the database. Now let's just pin the SQL Server Object Explorer here so you can see my two databases that I have in there already, and I'll just refresh to make sure you believe me. And we'll call update-database. Now watch this. I'm going to speed it up though. Okay, now if I refresh the list of databases, now we have our add identity WASM database. And this has all the tables that the identity system can use, including users, roles, and user roles, which relates the two. Those are the main ones that we're going to be using. We're not going to use them directly. I've got a little trick up my sleeve. All right, next we need an authenticating controller. So I'm going to add a class to the controllers folder called OIDC Configuration Controller. See, it's a little more complex with a WebAssembly application than a Blazor server application. Blazor server, everything's on the server and you don't need this API layer. And stick around to the end because Jeremy Lickness from Microsoft is going to jump in and tell you what you can look forward to in .NET 8 as it pertains to Blazor authentication and authorization. All right, let's configure the client now. We're going to go to the CS.proj file and we're going to add these items: ASP.NET Core components, WebAssembly authentication, and HTTP extensions. And what Blazor Train episode would be complete without a little trip to JavaScript land. Open up index.html, and we're going to add this script right here. Microsoft ASP.NET Core Components, WebAssembly, Authentication, Authentication Service.js. Yep, even the JavaScript is handled for us. Now we have a couple of using statements to add to our underscore imports file. And now I'm going to build the solution before continuing on. Now, let's change App Razor. Look at this guy right here, the route view, right? This happens when the route is found, like counter or fetch data, for example. The route view takes all the data associated with it and uses the layout, which our default layout is main layout, right? So check this out. Now I've got an authorized route view. Everything else is the same, but it's authorized. This is what happens when you are authorized, and then this is what happens when you're not authorized. In our case, it's going to redirect the user to login. The whole thing is wrapped in a cascading authentication state component. That lets us access the state of the user, the claims principal, in any component or page as a cascading parameter. All right, let's deal with this redirect to login right here. We need to add that. I'm going to add that to the shared folder. And we're going to need a login display. Now, you don't need a login display, but it's nice to show the user if they're logged in or they're not logged in, and give them buttons for registering and logging in and logging out. It's just kind of nice to have. Next, we need to go to main layout and add our login display right here. Now we need a little helper class to parse out the roles from the claims. So I'm going to add a class called Custom User Factory. And this is right out of the documentation. It extends account claims principal factory of remote user account, right? So this is going to be used with the API. When we get the token back, we're going to parse out the role claims. All right, let's go to program on the client side. And this line right here, I don't really care where you are in a hosted WebAssembly application. If you've modified it, you probably got something that creates an HTTP client with the base address. We're going to replace all of that with this. So we're going to add an HTTP client with the name Add Identity WASM Server API. You want to use the name of your solution. We specify the base address just like we did before. And now we're adding an HTTP message handler, base address authorization message handler. And that comes right out of Microsoft ASP.NET Core Components, WebAssembly Authentication. Now that we have that, we're going to get an instance of that HTTP client that's scoped for the user. And that HTTP client will include access tokens when making requests to the server project. Then we're calling Add API Authorization, adding an account claims principal factory of Custom User Factory. And that's it for the client-side program. One more thing we need in the Pages folder is an authentication component. And they wrap everything up nicely in this remote authenticator view. Very nice. All right, that's about it for authentication on the client side. Let's talk about authorization. Authorization for markup and code is obviously on the client side. So we're going to add some authentication in the nav menu. So what I've done is I've wrapped the link to counter in an authorized view. That means you have to be registered and logged in for this nav link to show up. Now for the fetch data link, not only do you have to be registered and logged in, but you also have to be in the admin role. Now we haven't talked about roles yet, but we will. We're going to leave this right here for now. If we run this now and we're not registered, we're not logged in, we should not be able to see the counter and fetch data links. Let's try it. Okay, now look, in my login display, I've got register, login, and about. And here's my regular hello world, but you can see I don't have links to counter and fetch data. However, I only authorized the links. I didn't actually authorize the pages. So I could just type counter right here, and we're at the counter page. Click, click, click. Now we're going to register, but first, there's one thing I forgot to do on the server side, so let's go back there. We need to add some folders. Areas. Under that, identity. Under that, pages. Under that, shared. And under shared, we're going to add a new item, underscore login partial.cshtml. You can copy and paste this right out of the repo. You have to change the using statement. And other than that, I think everything else is pretty generic. All right, now we can register. I'm going to use the account myuser@myplace.com. And I'm going to pick a password that's easy to remember, but satisfies the requirements. Now we have to confirm the registration, confirm the account. What does that do? Well, if you go into ASP.NET Users in the database and view the data, you'll see the email confirmed field is set to false. All we really have to do is set it to true. We could just do that here, but that's what this does. All right, it's confirmed. If I go back and refresh the data, now it's true. Now I can log in. Okay, now I see the counter because I'm logged in, but I still don't see fetch data because I'm not in an admin role, right? Before we do that, let me just confirm that I can go to fetch data. Yes, I can. All right, so we need to button up both the counter and the fetch data pages themselves because look, if I'm logged out, I can still go to counter. So let's fix that. We're going to go to the counter page, and right at line 2, I'm going to set this authorize attribute, just like you would see in a server-side controller or something like that. So this basically says, hey, if you try to go to the counter page, you won't see any of it if you're not logged in. Now let's button up fetch data. This one, we need to authorize the user according to the admin role. All right, so there's the authorize attribute, and in parentheses, roles equals, and then a comma separated list of roles. So this says, not only do you have to be registered and logged in, but you have to be in the admin role just to see this page. All right, now we shouldn't be able to go to either of them. Okay, now I'm logged out, right? So let's try to go to counter, and it redirects me to the login. That's good. We're going to get the same thing if we go to fetch data. Okay, so let's log in. All right, so now fetch data says I'm not authorized to access this resource, but the counter nav link is there and I can access the counter page. All right, well, I can't access fetch data because I'm not in the admin role, and I can't see the link because I'm not in the admin role. So let's add me to the admin role. And for that, we're going to use my Identity Manager library. This is a .NET Standard class library based on the GitHub repo by M. Guinness that I showed in these episodes. More than a springboard to get going, but essentially You can write a console app to manage users and roles. In our case, I've created a Blazor server app that uses the library to manage users and roles, and all you have to do is point it at that same database, give it the same connection string, and it'll do its magic. So you could download the zip file and run it, and then once we load it up in Visual Studio, we'll run this Identity Manager Blazor server app. All right, so here's my Blazor server application. There's the library right there, and I also just included a Blazor server app that we could authorize based on the same database, but have to at least change the connection string to point to the same database. Add Identity WASM. That's the name of my database. Right there. Okay, so if I click on users, there's my user at myplace.com. If I go to roles, there should be no roles yet. Let's create a new one. I'm going to call it admin. Now I can go back to users, click the edit button on my user at myplace.com, and add them to the admin role. Press save. I'm going to leave this running. I'm going to go back to my Add Identity WASM application. So if your claims have changed, in this case the roles claim, if that has changed and you're logged in, you have to log out and log back in order to get a new token with those claims, right? So I'm going to log in. And now everybody's happy. I can go to fetch data. I can see the fetch data link. The counter works just as before, and everybody's authorized. Now, how about code? How can I authorize code to execute or not execute based on the role? Well, it's actually pretty easy. Remember, AppRaiser has this cascading authentication state. That means I can inspect the user and their roles and whether they're logged in or not with an authentication state cascading parameter. So let's change counter. I still have my authorize attribute. I've added this error message right there, which is an empty string by default. I'm going to show it in red if, it's not null. And here's my cascading parameter. It's a task of authentication state, and you define it with that cascading parameter attribute. And I also have this claims principal object that I've named user, and this is going to identify the user to us. So if you go down to onInitialized async, you'll see that I can await the authentication state because it's a task, and then I can grab the user property, which will be that claims principal. Now, when I go to increment the count, I can inspect that user. This is how you check to see if the user is not logged in, and that should never happen because of this, right? So we have to have a user at this point, and the user has to be authenticated. So this is how you can check. User.identity.isAuthenticated. And this should also never happen. Here's where the magic happens. If the user is in role, and I've created this role counter clicker, well, I haven't created it yet, but I will. If they're in that role, yes, you can increment the count. Otherwise, we're going to set the error message to you don't have permission. Now let's try it again. All right, let's log in. Okay, let's try to increment the counter. You do not have permission. Sorry, Charlie. Okay, what are we going to do about that? How about this? Let's create a role called counter clicker and add my user to the counter clicker role. Boom. Now we're done with this. Now we have to log out and log back in. And now that we're in the counter clicker role, we can click the button. Isn't that awesome? Okay, well, the counter has been overdone, but the point is that you can authorize code based on what role the user is in. So what did we do today? Well, we created a new hosted Blazor WebAssembly project without any authentication template code. That's a stand-in for one of your existing applications. We added an identity database connection string to app settings JSON and also configured identity server. We added support for identity roles on the server side. We added a DB context, and we generated the migration to create the database. We generated the database. We added support code and markup for server-based authentication and authorization. We configured the client. We ran the app and registered a new user. We authorized the markup in Nav Menu Razor. We authorized the counter in Fetch Data Pages. We used the Identity Manager library with the Blazor server app to add roles and assign them. And we authorized access to code using a claims principal object that represents the user. Now back to you in the studio, Carl. According to Jeremy Lickness from Microsoft, in .NET 8, they're introducing some new tech around auth in Blazor WebAssembly apps. Here's Jeremy.
Authentication and authorization have been a top-of-the-list priority for a lot of developers, the top voted list in the ASP.NET repo for specific scenarios. So when we talk about ways that you can authenticate and authorize your app, there are things that you can install locally, there are managed services, there are products, so there's a variety of ways. And so the scenario that we focused on for .NET 8 is what we call self-host. So this is where someone is hosting a site, they need login security, but they don't necessarily need to do things like call a web API with special security that's in a third-party system or grant access to an external system. These things require more complicated flows, but if it's just my users, my system, we call that self-host, and that's what the ASP.NET Core Identity System services. It gives you a self-host way of managing identities. And so what we focused on was a couple things. The single-page app experience, so when you're doing like Angular, JavaScript, or Blazor WebAssembly, for example, that experience was not the greatest experience because the screens that let you manage your identity experience, change your password, set up two-factor authentication, were all server rendered. So you went out of your, oh, this is my snappy single-page application to here's an old style server rendered experience and bounce back and forth. So to address that, we are exposing a set of APIs that people were hacking together themselves, but now we're giving them out of the box so that you can call an endpoint and do things like log in. And we're giving you the safest default option for when you're self-hosting, which is a cookie, because it's ambient, so to speak, right? So that cookie, once it's set, is automatically set in the header of the browser. You don't have to do anything as a developer. But the reality is there are clients, like some people will have this application stood up and they want a mobile client to access it. And a mobile client doesn't, if it's not running a browser, doesn't have a cookie management solution, right? So then we go to tokens. So we're providing tokens, but the important thing for people to understand is this is the easy, I'm setting up an app, it's a local app. We're trying to make that experience as easy as possible. If you get to the level that you need to start interfacing with multiple systems, etc., then you want to look at something like Azure AD, right, which is our offering for that, or something that we had before that was installed on premise, which is called Identity Server, which is a OAuth OIDC. It's a set of technology related to authentication and authorization, but it gives you management of more complex flows with that. So we're not trying to be a security provider and provide that full-blown solution, but we do recognize we have a huge number of developers who have those isolated apps that just want to experience that they can feel secure without having the overhead of configuring like a full-blown OIDC server, etc.
Thanks, Jeremy. When .NET 8 comes out, I'll do a whole new series on authentication and authorization in Blazor for .NET 8. Until then, we can do things the .NET 7 way. Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time.
Blaze a train!